So, here's my story. I'm not really the type of guy to post on Reddit, but I just don't know where else to turn right now. My name's Jack, I'm 38, and I've been married to Melissa, 35, for almost 10 years now. We've had a solid relationship for the most part. We met in college, and she was everything I wanted: smart, funny, and beautiful. We have 2 kids together, Emily 8 and Jacob 5, and our life, at least on the surface, seemed pretty good. But about 6 months ago, things started to feel off. Melissa had started acting differently, just little things at first. She used to be open about her day, talking about her job and whatever drama was happening at work. But lately, she'd been more distant. She was always on her phone, but when I asked her about it, she'd brush me off with excuses like, "Oh, it's just the girls from work," or "I'm just checking emails." I'm not the jealous type. I've always trusted her, and I never thought she'd do anything to hurt me or our family. But as time went on, I couldn't ignore the little signs anymore. Late-night texts, sudden work trips that didn't seem necessary, and this weird new energy she had, like she was always distracted. I knew something was up, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. I was trying to be supportive. We've had our rough patches before, but we always worked through them. So, when she told me she was going out with her work friends for a girls' night, I didn't think much of it at first. But that's when things really started spiraling. Melissa's girls' night became a regular thing. Every Friday, she'd get all dressed up, way more than usual, and head out with her friends. At first, I didn't mind. I figured she needed the break from the kids and work. But then it started to feel excessive. She wouldn't come home until after midnight, and when I asked how it was, her answers were vague. "Oh, it was fine. Just the usual." I started noticing more changes. She was spending more time getting ready, doing her makeup, fixing her hair like she was going on a date. One night, she wore a dress I hadn't even seen before. When I asked her where she got it, she just shrugged and said, "Oh, I've had this for a while." You just never notice. That stung. I did notice. I noticed everything, and things were starting to add up in a way I didn't like. Then, she started getting texts late at night. I'd be next to her in bed, and her phone would light up. She'd grab it quickly, turning away from me as she typed. When I asked who it was, she'd roll her eyes and say, "It's just Jenna from work. We're planning a team project." But something about her tone didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the Melissa I knew. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But my gut told me there was more to it than she was letting on. I didn't want to accuse her without proof, though. I didn't want to be that guy. The insecure husband who thinks his wife is cheating just because she's getting more attention than usual. Still, the doubt crept in. Every time she left for these girls' nights, I'd sit at home wondering, was she really with her friends? Or was she with someone else? Someone I didn't know about? My mind started spinning, but I didn't want to confront her without anything concrete. So, the Friday nights kept happening, and Melissa was more and more distant. She wasn't just leaving late and coming back after midnight anymore. She started staying out until 2 or 3 in the morning. Every time she got home, she'd smell like expensive perfume and alcohol, which didn't bother me at first, but after a while, I couldn't ignore it. When I'd ask her what took so long or why she didn't text me, she'd get defensive. "Jack, it's just a night out. I don't have to check in every 5 minutes." I didn't push it. I wasn't trying to control her, but it felt like she was starting to live a life I wasn't a part of. The connection we had, the easy conversations, the inside jokes, all of that was disappearing. She was glued to her phone even more than usual, and whenever I got close to her, she'd flip it over or leave the room to take calls. One Saturday morning, after one of her late nights, she was in the shower and I saw her phone light up on the bedside table. I wasn't planning to snoop, but my curiosity got the best of me. The message preview popped up, and it wasn't from any of her friends or coworkers. It was from a guy named Eric. The message just said, "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you." My stomach dropped. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the phone, but I felt frozen. I wanted to believe it was innocent, that maybe it was just a flirty text gone too far, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't something you sent to a friend. Not when you're married with kids. I didn't touch her phone. I put it back exactly where it was and waited. My mind was racing, trying to come up with every possible excuse for her. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she was just texting someone as a joke. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew the truth. Melissa was hiding something big, and this wasn't just my imagination. When she came out of the shower, she didn't notice my mood at first. She was scrolling through her phone like usual, and then I watched her face change. She quickly swiped the message away and locked her phone. I didn't confront her right then. I wanted to, but the words wouldn't come out. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't want to explode without more information. I needed to be sure. If I accused her without solid proof, I knew she'd twist it, make me seem crazy, and somehow turn it into my fault. I needed something concrete, but more than that, I needed time to process what was happening. That night, I barely slept. I kept turning everything over in my mind. How long had this been going on? Who was this Eric? How had I missed the signs? Our life had been so normal, or at least that's what I thought. But looking back, the pieces started to fall into place. The sudden interest in going out, the new clothes, the secrecy with her phone. It was all there, but I just hadn't wanted to see it. After that message from Eric, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know more. My gut was screaming at me that something was seriously wrong, but I didn't want to act without being absolutely sure. I wasn't about to tear my family apart without solid proof. So I decided to take things into my own hands. I hated the idea of snooping, but what else could I do? Confronting her too soon would only make her cover her tracks better. The next weekend, while Melissa was out again, I went through her phone. She had left it charging in the kitchen, and I knew she'd set up her fingerprint lock, but what she didn't realize was that mine worked too. It took me a second to figure out how to act casual, but once I opened her messages, there it was, Eric. Their conversation was long. I scrolled back through weeks of texts, and my worst fears were confirmed. It wasn't just flirting. They had been meeting up for months. There were late-night messages, photos, and even talk of how she'd missed him when she was away with us on a family trip to the beach. My hands started shaking as I read the words she'd sent him, words she hadn't said to me in years. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. She had written just a few days ago. It wasn't just physical. They were talking like they were in a relationship, like we didn't even exist. She'd mentioned how she was sick of me, how she wished she could leave but was worried about the kids. And he, of course, played right into it, saying how much better off she'd be with him, how he was the escape she needed. I felt like I was going to throw up. My head was spinning, and I could barely breathe. This was my wife, the mother of my children, sharing parts of herself that I thought were mine alone with some guy I didn't even know existed. I kept scrolling, as painful as it was. I couldn't stop. I had to know the full story. It turns out, Eric wasn't some random guy. He was an old college friend of hers who had recently moved back to town. They'd reconnected at one of those girls' nights she had started going to, and it escalated from there. The text showed meetups at hotels, restaurants, places she had lied about going, saying it was work dinners or team outings. And then I saw it. They had a trip planned for next weekend, one of the work trips she had mentioned. But this time, they weren't even hiding it. She was meeting him at some fancy hotel downtown, and it was clear what their plans were. She was going to spend the entire weekend with him. I couldn't keep reading. I locked her phone and put it back where I found it. My hands were still trembling, and my chest felt tight. I had my proof, but instead of feeling empowered, I just felt shattered. I wanted to scream, to call her, and demand an explanation. But part of me still couldn't believe it. How had it come to this? Was it me? Had I missed the signs for so long that I pushed her into someone else's arms? The guilt mixed with the anger, and I didn't know what to do next. I spent the rest of that week walking around in a daze. Every time I looked at Melissa, all I could see was her with him. She had no idea I knew, and that just made it worse. Every time she kissed me goodnight or smiled at the kids, it felt fake, like she was living a double life right in front of me. I knew I couldn't keep this bottled up forever, but I had no clue how to confront her without blowing up. Friday rolled around, the day before her planned work trip with Eric. She was getting ready, packing her things like she was heading to some important business meeting. I watched her carefully fold her clothes, humming to herself, completely unaware that I knew her secret. It made my blood boil. How could she act so casual, so normal, while planning to sneak off with another man? I couldn't hold it in any longer. As she zipped up her suitcase, I walked into the bedroom, trying to keep my voice steady. "Melissa, we need to talk." She looked up at me, surprised by my tone. "About what?" she asked, her smile fading a little. I stared at her, trying to find the right words, but everything I wanted to say came crashing out all at once. "I know about Eric." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw panic flash across her face. She quickly recovered, though, trying to act like she didn't know what I was talking about. "What? Who's Eric?" I shook my head. "Don't play dumb. I've seen the messages. I know everything. The late-night texts, the hotel meetups. I know you've been sneaking around with him for months." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, instead of apologizing or explaining, she crossed her arms and gave me this cold, defiant look. "So, what? You're spying on me now? Going through my phone? That's really low, Jack." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I'm the one in the wrong here? You're the one cheating on me, lying to me, and you're mad because I found out?" She scoffed and rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. Our marriage has been dead for a long time, Jack. Don't act like you didn't see this coming. You're never around. You're always working, and when you are home, it's like you don't even see me. What was I supposed to do? Just sit here and wait for you to care again?" I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "So, this is my fault? You're cheating because I work to provide for our family? Because I don't sit around catering to your every need? You don't even try anymore," she shot back. "You haven't in years. Eric actually pays attention to me, makes me feel alive again. You wouldn't understand." I was floored. She was twisting everything, making it sound like her betrayal was somehow justified. "And what about our kids, Melissa? What about our family? You're just going to throw all of that away for some fling?" She looked away, biting her lip, but her silence told me everything. She wasn't going to stop. She didn't want to fix anything. She had already checked out of our marriage, and I was just catching up. "You're still going to meet him tomorrow, aren't you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't deny it. Instead, she grabbed her suitcase and headed for the door. "I think it's best if I leave for a few days. We can talk about this when I get back." And just like that, she was gone. No apology, no explanation, just gone. I stood there in the empty bedroom, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The woman I had spent the last 10 years of my life with had walked out, and I had no idea if she was ever coming back. After Melissa walked out the door with her suitcase, the house felt unbearably empty. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sounds of the kids playing downstairs, completely unaware of what was happening. I stood in our bedroom, staring at the space where she had been just minutes earlier, trying to process what had just gone down. I couldn't believe it. She hadn't even tried to deny it for long. She didn't show any real remorse or guilt, just excuses. It was like she had already made up her mind, and nothing I could say would change it. I wanted to yell, scream, punch a wall, but what good would that do? None of it would make her come back or undo what she had done. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, and it made me sick. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, wondering if there was something I could have said differently, if there was some way to stop her from leaving. But no matter how hard I tried to find a solution, it always came back to the same thing. She had made her choice. The next morning, I woke up early, exhausted but running on adrenaline. I had to face the kids. I didn't want to lie to them, but I wasn't ready to tell them the truth either. Emily asked me where Mommy was, and I told her that Mommy had to go on a work trip for a few days. It wasn't technically a lie, but it felt like one. She just shrugged and went back to watching cartoons, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. The whole weekend passed in a blur. I took the kids to the park, tried to keep things normal, but every minute felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't hear a word from Melissa. No texts, no calls, nothing. It was like she had completely checked out of our lives, leaving me to deal with the mess. By Sunday night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to someone to get this off my chest. I called my best friend, Mike, and asked him to come over. I hadn't told him anything yet, but he could tell from my voice that something was wrong. When he arrived, I finally let it all out. I told him everything. The late nights, the texts, the confrontation, and how Melissa had just walked out like it was no big deal. Mike sat there, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man, I'm so sorry. I had no idea things were this bad. What are you gonna do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to fight for my family, but I don't think Melissa does. She's already gone. It's like she's moved on, and I'm just playing catch-up." Mike stayed with me for a few hours, trying to give me advice, but I could tell he was just as lost as I was. There was no easy answer. Part of me wanted to call Melissa, to beg her to come back, but the other part of me knew that wouldn't fix anything. I couldn't make her want to stay if she didn't care anymore. By Monday morning, Melissa still hadn't contacted me. No texts, no calls, not even to check on the kids. It was like she had vanished. I dropped Emily and Jacob off at school, trying to keep up the act that everything was normal, but inside, I was crumbling. I was stuck in this limbo where I didn't know what to do next. Should I be making plans for divorce? Should I wait for her to come back and beg for forgiveness? I didn't know how to move forward. After dropping off the kids, I sat in the car for a while, staring at my phone. I wanted to call her, demand to know where she was, and if she even planned on coming back. But something inside me told me not to. If she wanted to fix this, she'd reach out, right? But the silence was crushing. Finally, around noon, I got a text from her. It was short, and it hit me like a slap in the face. "I need some space. I'll be staying with a friend for a while. Please don't contact me unless it's about the kids." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just space. I couldn't believe it. After 10 years of marriage, she was giving me a cold, distant text like I was just some casual acquaintance. It took everything in me not to call her right then and there, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. She had made up her mind. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to fix things. She wanted out. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't even think straight. I felt like I was grieving, like I had lost something that was never coming back. But as the hours passed, I started to realize something. I couldn't keep waiting for her. I couldn't keep holding on to the hope that she'd come back and magically want to fix our marriage. She had already made her choice, and I had to start making mine. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat down with a beer and started going through everything in my head. All the little lies, the distance, the cheating. It all added up to the same thing. Melissa had checked out of our marriage a long time ago, and I had just been too blind to see it. The realization hit me hard. I had been trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Maybe it had been gone for months, maybe even longer. I thought we were just going through a rough patch, that we could work things out like we always had, but this was different. This wasn't something we could fix with a few conversations or some time apart. She didn't want to be with me anymore. She had already chosen someone else. It hurt like hell, but for the first time since all of this started, I felt a weird sense of clarity. I couldn't keep living in denial. I couldn't keep pretending that things would go back to the way they were. I had to accept that my marriage was over, whether I wanted it to be or not. After that painful realization, something shifted inside me. I still loved Melissa, and part of me always would, but I couldn't live in this limbo anymore. She wasn't coming back, not really, not as the person I thought she was. The woman I married had changed, and she wasn't interested in fixing what was broken between us. I had to start thinking about what was best for me and the kids. The next few days were rough. I didn't reach out to her, and she didn't contact me beyond a couple of short texts about the kids. It was clear she wasn't ready to face the consequences of what she'd done, and I couldn't force her to. Every day, that passed without any meaningful communication from her made it clearer that I had to take control of the situation. I decided to talk to a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew I had to protect myself and the kids. If Melissa wanted to move on with her life, then I had to make sure that when she did, I wasn't left picking up the pieces alone. I made an appointment with a divorce attorney who came highly recommended by one of my coworkers. I wasn't fully committed to divorce yet, but I wanted to know my options, especially when it came to custody of Emily and Jacob. Sitting in the lawyer's office was surreal. It felt like I was watching my life fall apart from the outside, like all of this was happening to someone else. The attorney, a woman named Sarah, was calm and professional as she explained the process to me. She asked a lot of questions about our marriage, Melissa's behavior, and what I wanted going forward. "What do you want in terms of custody?" Sarah asked, looking up from her notepad. "I want joint custody," I said, without hesitation. "I want to be there for my kids, no matter what happens between Melissa and me." She nodded. "That's reasonable. We can work toward that. But if you're serious about moving forward with divorce, you need to be prepared. This might get messy, especially if your wife isn't cooperative." I knew she was right. Melissa was unpredictable lately, and I had no idea how she would react if I filed for divorce. But I couldn't let her walk all over me. I had to think about the kids. They deserved stability, and I couldn't let Melissa's affair throw our whole family into chaos. Sarah gave me a list of things to prepare: financial documents, proof of her infidelity, which I already had thanks to those texts, and other details about our assets. She also told me that we could start with a separation agreement if I wasn't ready to jump straight to divorce. It would give us time to figure things out while protecting my rights. I left her office, feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt a sense of relief that I was taking control of my situation. On the other, it hurt to realize that this was really happening. I was on the path to ending my marriage, and once that door was open, there was no going back. After speaking with the lawyer, I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to face the toughest part: telling Melissa that I had seen a lawyer and was considering separation, maybe even divorce. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and once I said the words, everything would come crashing down for real. But I couldn't keep pretending that things would magically fix themselves. I had to protect myself and the kids. Melissa came back to the house that Friday. She didn't bring her suitcase with her, just some clothes in a small bag. I could tell by the way she walked in that she wasn't here to talk about us. She was just here for the kids. She acted like nothing had changed, like she hadn't just left me a week ago, with barely a word. But I wasn't going to let her avoid this any longer. Once the kids were in bed, I asked her to sit down in the living room. She looked at me warily, clearly sensing that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "We need to talk, Melissa," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "This can't keep going like this." She sighed and crossed her arms, leaning back in the chair. "I know, Jack, but I told you I just need some time. We could talk about everything when things calm down." I shook my head. "No, you don't get to just walk out and leave everything up in the air. We have kids, a life. You owe it to me to them to be honest about what's going on. You're not just going to come and go whenever you feel like it." Her face hardened. "What do you want me to say? I told you I needed space." "You didn't need space, Melissa. You needed Eric." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. I was done pretending like this was something we could brush off. She flinched, but didn't deny it. "I told you it's complicated." "It's not that complicated," I said, my voice low but firm. "You've been seeing him behind my back for months. That's not something we can just brush under the rug." I went to a lawyer. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in them. "You went to a lawyer? For what?" "To figure out what happens next," I said bluntly. "Whether we separate or divorce, I need to protect myself. I need to protect the kids." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "So that's it? You're just going to give up on us?" I laughed bitterly. "I'm giving up? You gave up a long time ago, Melissa. I'm just finally catching up. She stood up, pacing around the room, clearly frustrated. I don't know what you want me to say, Jack. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but it did. And now I'm trying to figure out what to do, but you going to a lawyer behind my back? That's a pretty big step. I didn't have a choice. You've been gone mentally and physically for months. What else was I supposed to do? She stopped pacing and looked at me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. So, what now? Are you filing for divorce? I don't know, I admitted. But I know I can't keep living like this. We can't keep pretending things will just go back to the way they were. Melissa sat back down, quieter now. I don't want to hurt the kids. Neither do I said, my voice softening a little. That's why we need to figure this out. We can't keep dragging them through this mess. They deserve better. She nodded, and for the first time in a while I saw a glimpse of the Melissa I used to know. She looked tired, defeated, like she knew this was coming but hadn't wanted to face it. I don't know what to say, Jack. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe you can't, I said honestly. Maybe we can't, but we owe it to ourselves, and to them, to try to figure out what happens next. We sat in silence for a while after that, both of us knowing that we were standing at a crossroads. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. After that conversation, everything felt different. There wasn't a big blowout, no screaming match or dramatic goodbye. Just this heavy, suffocating silence. Melissa didn't stay that night. After we talked, she grabbed her bag and told me she'd stay at a friend's place for a few more days. I didn't fight her on it. At this point, her being around only added to the tension. The days that followed were a blur. I threw myself into being there for the kids, keeping them on their normal routine as much as possible. Emily asked where her mom was a couple of times, but I stuck to the same story. Mommy's just taking some time to herself. It felt like a flimsy excuse, but they accepted it. Jacob didn't ask any questions. He was too young to really notice the shift in our world. In those moments alone, though, I couldn't help but feel this sinking dread. The house felt empty without her, even if our marriage had been breaking long before this. I found myself walking past her side of the closet, catching glimpses of her clothes, and wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. Then came the hardest part, the financial reality. One morning I sat down with a notebook and started running the numbers. Divorce or separation wasn't just going to break us emotionally. It was going to destroy us financially too. We had a mortgage, car payments, school fees. It all started adding up in my head. We weren't living paycheck to paycheck, but we also weren't in a position to split our lives into two separate households. The lawyer had warned me about this, but now, seeing the numbers on paper, it hit me hard. If we went through with this, I'd have to move out, or she would. One of us would keep the house, and the other would need to find a place. Splitting custody of the kids meant figuring out how we'd manage the expenses on top of everything else. It wasn't just about the emotional fallout anymore, it was about survival. Could we even afford to split? That afternoon, Melissa texted me, saying she wanted to meet and discuss what comes next. I agreed, but this time I knew I couldn't let her brush off the logistics. We weren't just a couple breaking up, we were parents with responsibilities. I had to get practical, even if my heart was still tangled up in the emotions. When we met, it was at a neutral spot, a coffee shop. I could tell from the moment she walked in that she was nervous. She sat down, and for a minute, neither of us said anything. Finally, she broke the silence. "So, what are we doing, Jack?" she asked, her voice quieter than I was used to. I took a deep breath. "We need to talk about the real stuff now. The house, the kids' money. This isn't just about us anymore." She nodded, though I could see the discomfort on her face. "I know. I've been thinking about that too. I don't know how we're going to manage this. We can't just drift through this, Melissa. We've got to be smart. Do you want the house? Or do we sell it?" "I don't want to sell it," she said quickly. "I don't want to uproot the kids right now." But she hesitated, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. "I can't afford the mortgage on my own, and I can't afford to pay for the house and rent somewhere else," I said, the cold reality hitting both of us. We talked logistics for a while, and it became clear that neither of us had a solid plan. The emotional weight was one thing, but the financial burden was another beast entirely. Every solution seemed impossible, but we couldn't ignore it any longer. We talked about splitting time with the kids, how we'd handle school pickups and drop-offs, and who would take the dog. It felt clinical, like we were dividing up assets rather than the life we had built together. But at least it was honest. For the first time in weeks, we weren't hiding behind excuses or pretending everything would magically get better. "I don't want to hurt them," Melissa said, her voice barely audible. "The kids, they didn't ask for this." "I know," I said. "Neither did I." She looked down at her hands, and for a moment I thought she might apologize. But she didn't. Instead, she just said, "I'll stay at my friend's place for a while longer. We'll figure this out. I'll figure this out." As we left the coffee shop, there was no hug, no goodbye kiss, just two people walking away from each other, trying to pick up the pieces of a broken life. The days following our conversation at the coffee shop were some of the hardest. Melissa stayed at her friend's place, and I was left to manage the house and the kids alone. It felt strange, like I was living in a house that wasn't really mine anymore. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of the life we had built together. The family photos on the wall, her favorite mug still in the kitchen cabinet. But the truth was, our life was over, and now I had to figure out how to move forward. Emily and Jacob were starting to notice something was wrong. Emily asked me why Mommy wasn't coming home, and I could tell Jacob felt the shift, even if he didn't fully understand it. I hated lying to them, but I wasn't ready to explain the whole truth yet. They were too young to carry the weight of our problems, so I told them what I could. "Mommy is staying with a friend for a little while, but we're still a family." The toughest part was the weekends. Melissa used to be the one who organized our family time, planning trips to the park or setting up playdates. Now it was just me, trying to fill the gaps. I took the kids to the zoo one Saturday, but even that fell off. The three of us walked around, and while the kids were having fun, I felt like an outsider watching someone else's life. I couldn't stop thinking about how different things were, how broken we had become. I found myself dreading the evenings the most. After the kids went to bed, I'd sit in the living room, the silence heavy around me. I tried to distract myself, watch TV, scrolled through my phone, but it was hard to escape the constant thoughts of what was happening. I kept replaying our marriage in my head, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Was it something I missed? Could I have done something differently? The guilt was overwhelming at times, but the anger was still there too. Melissa texted me occasionally, mostly about the kids or logistics. She wasn't avoiding the hard stuff anymore, but there was still a distance between us, like she was trying to hold everything at arm's length. I didn't press her for answers. I knew it wouldn't help. We were both in survival mode, just trying to get through each day without falling apart. A week later, we had another sit-down to discuss the next steps. This time, we met at the house. It felt odd, having her there again, like a ghost of the life we used to share. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together, and I could see the weight of everything we were about to discuss weighing on her. "We need to figure out a custody schedule," she said, not meeting my eyes. "For the kids. I think we should do 50-50ths, but we need to decide how to split the time." I nodded, even though it hurt to think about not being with Emily and Jacob every day. "That makes sense. We can alternate weeks, or maybe split the weekdays and weekends." She nodded, and we spent the next hour hashing out the details. It was practical, efficient, but completely soul-crushing. We were dividing our kids' lives between us like they were part of a business transaction. It wasn't how I had imagined my life turning out. When we were done, there was a long pause. Melissa finally looked up at me, her eyes full of guilt and sadness. "I never wanted this, Jack," she said softly. "I know," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I really believed it. Maybe she hadn't wanted this outcome, but she had made the choices that led us here. "But this is where we are," she nodded. And for a moment, it looked like she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she stood up, grabbed her bag, and told me she'd text me the next day about the schedule. Just like that, She was gone again, leaving me to sit in the empty kitchen, wondering how we'd gotten to this point. After Melissa left that day, it really started to hit me that this was my new reality. We had agreed on a custody schedule, weekdays split between us, alternating weekends, and we were officially living separate lives. The house felt emptier than ever. Even though I had the kids with me half the time, the silence when they were gone was suffocating. The first weekend without them was the hardest. It was the first time in years that I'd spent more than a few hours in the house completely alone. I'd always imagined that if I ever had a weekend to myself, I'd get caught up on projects, maybe relax with a few beers and watch a game. But now none of that sounded appealing. Every corner of the house felt like it was mocking me with memories of what we used to have. I could hear the echoes of the kids' laughter, the sound of Melissa humming in the kitchen while she cooked. It was like the house was frozen in time, but everything inside of me had changed. I tried to keep myself busy. I went for a run, something I hadn't done in years. I called up a few friends to grab a drink, but even that felt strange. I hadn't really opened up to anyone yet about what was happening. When they asked how I was doing, I gave them the same line I had been using for weeks. We're figuring things out, but the truth was, I didn't know how to figure anything out. My mind was constantly spinning, thinking about the kids, about the divorce, and about her. Was she seeing Eric on the weekends she didn't have the kids? Were they moving on, building a new life while I was stuck picking up the pieces? The worst part was the loneliness. I never realized how much I had relied on Melissa, even when things were bad between us. She was still my partner, the person I'd shared everything with for years. And now I had no one to share anything with. The empty house, the quiet nights, it all felt like too much. By Sunday night, I was ready to see the kids again. I missed them more than I thought possible. When I picked them up, Jacob ran into my arms like nothing had changed, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. But then Emily asked the question I had been dreading. "Why can't Mommy come home?" she said, looking up at me with those big, innocent eyes. I froze. I wasn't ready for this. "Mommy's staying at a friend's house right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we're still a family. You'll see her tomorrow." Emily didn't say anything after that, but I could tell she was confused. I hated lying to her, hated that we were pulling her and Jacob into this mess. But what was I supposed to say? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that their parents are breaking apart? The next few weeks passed in a blur. Melissa and I stuck to the custody schedule, keeping things civil for the kids, but our conversations were short and tense. We communicated mostly through texts, exchanging basic information about school pickups, dinner plans, and the occasional doctor's appointment. It was like we were coworkers managing a shared project, our children, but we didn't talk about anything deeper. Every time I saw her, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and guilt. I knew I couldn't hold on to the hope of fixing things, but that didn't stop the pain. There was one night, after I had put the kids to bed, where I found myself scrolling through old photos. Pictures of us, when we were happy, before things fell apart. There was one from a trip we took to the beach, when Emily was just a toddler, and Melissa was pregnant with Jacob. We were smiling, carefree, like we had everything in the world. Looking at those photos now, it felt like I was looking at strangers. How had we gone from that to this? I don't know why, but I sent her a text that night. I wasn't expecting anything, but I had to get it out of my system. "Do you ever miss how things used to be?" I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting. I wasn't even sure what kind of response I wanted. Maybe I just needed to know that she was feeling something too, that I wasn't the only one looking back and wondering where we went wrong. But her response was short, cold. "I do. But we can't go back, Jack." And that was it. No apology, no regret, just a door closing on everything we had built together. I knew then that it was really over. There was no saving this, no turning back. All I could do now was figure out how to live with the pieces that were left. After that text, I knew things would never go back to the way they were. Melissa had closed the door on our marriage, and I had to start accepting that. It wasn't easy, but something shifted in me that night. I couldn't keep living in the past, replaying the same memories and wondering what went wrong. I had to focus on the future, for myself and for the kids. I threw myself into being a dad, making sure that Emily and Jacob felt as normal as possible. On the weekends I had them. I took them to the park, helped with homework, and made pancakes every Saturday morning. It wasn't always easy. There were still nights where I'd feel the crushing loneliness once they were in bed. But it gave me purpose. The kids were my anchor. Melissa and I continued to keep things civil. We didn't fight, and we didn't have long, emotional talks. Our communication was strictly about the kids or logistics, and I think we both preferred it that way. It was easier than rehashing what had happened between us. I didn't ask about Eric, and she didn't offer any information. At this point, I didn't want to know. It was just more pain I didn't need. One evening, after dropping the kids off at Melissa's, I decided to call Mike, my best friend. I hadn't really opened up to anyone about everything that had happened. I kept telling myself I could handle it on my own. But the truth was, I needed someone to talk to. "Hey man," I said when he picked up. "You got time for a drink? I could use one." Mike didn't ask any questions, just told me to meet him at the usual spot. When I got there, I told him everything about Melissa, Eric the lawyer, and how I'd been trying to hold it all together for the kids. "Damn, Jack," he said, shaking his head. "I had no idea it was this bad. I knew something was up, but—" "Yeah, well, I didn't really want to admit it to anyone, including myself," I replied, staring down at my beer. "But it's real now. It's over." He nodded. "So, what's next? What do you want to do?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Just keep going, I guess. Be there for the kids. Try to figure out how to live without her." Mike looked at me, and for the first time in a while, I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't alone in this. And maybe, just maybe, I could start to move on. Talking to Mike helped more than I expected. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. I wasn't constantly consumed by thoughts of Melissa, or the mess our life had turned into. I still had hard days, plenty of them, but the suffocating weight on my chest was starting to lift. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to move forward. The next few weeks were focused on the kids and settling into our new routine. The custody schedule had become second nature, and while it was still strange not having them with me every day, I was getting used to it. I started making plans for the weekends I had free, catching up with friends, going to the gym, even picking up an old hobby, photography. It was something I hadn't done in years, but it gave me an outlet, something that was just mine. Melissa and I kept things strictly business. She'd pick up the kids, we'd exchange a few polite words, and that was it. I could tell she was still seeing Eric, but she never mentioned him, and I didn't ask. There was no point. That part of our life was done, and the less I thought about it, the better. One afternoon, when I was picking up the kids from school, Emily asked me a question I wasn't expecting. "Daddy, are you happy?" The question hit me hard. I paused, looking at her little face, and wondered how much she had picked up on over the past few months. Kids always notice more than we think. "I'm getting there, sweetie," I said, smiling down at her. "Things are just different now, but I'm okay." She nodded, accepting my answer, and ran off to play with Jacob. But her question stuck with me. Was I happy? Not yet, but I was starting to feel like I could be. That weekend, I took the kids to the beach. It wasn't a big trip, just a day out to get away from everything. But it was perfect. Watching them laugh, playing in the sand, and just enjoying the moment reminded me that life wasn't over. It was different, yes, but there was still a lot to look forward to. As we drove back home that evening, with the kids asleep in the back seat, I realized something. I was going to be okay. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but I was finally moving on. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking less about what had happened, and more about what lay ahead. The pain was still there, of course, but it wasn't as sharp. I wasn't constantly replaying everything that went wrong between Melissa and me. Instead, I was focusing on rebuilding not just for the kids, but for myself. Melissa and I settled into a routine. We were co-parents now, and while we weren't friends, we were civil. The kids seemed to be adjusting too. They didn't ask as many questions about why things had changed, and they were getting used to splitting their time between two homes. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. One evening, after I'd put the kids to bed, I found myself standing in the hallway, looking at an old photo of the four of us from a family vacation. We were all smiling, happy, frozen in time. For a long moment I stared at the picture, remembering how things used to be. But then I did something I hadn't been able to do before. I put the photo away. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about letting go. Melissa and I had shared a life, and for a while it was a good one. But that chapter was over. Holding on to it wasn't going to help me move forward. It was time to close that door for good. The next weekend, I took the kids to my parents' house for a family gathering. It was the first time I'd seen them since everything had gone down. My mom, always the worrier, hugged me a little tighter than usual, and my dad gave me that knowing look that said more than words ever could. We spent the afternoon outside, the kids running around with their cousins, while I sat with my dad on the porch. He didn't pry or ask too many questions, he just listened. "You know," he said after a while, "life doesn't always go the way we plan. But that doesn't mean it's over. You got a lot left, Jack. And I'm proud of you for how you're handling it." I didn't say anything for a moment, just nodded, taking in his words. He was right. Life didn't go the way I'd planned, but I still had a future I was ready to start embracing. As the sun set and the kids piled into the car, exhausted from the day, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't dwelling on what I'd lost. I was ready to let go of the past and start looking forward to what came next. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be happy again.